My father-in-law spent years calling me a charity case and telling my wife she deserved better. Now he pays me rent to live in what used to be his house. I'm a 35-year-old guy, married to my wife Sarah, for about 5 years now. We met in college, where she and I both had a pretty simple life. We weren't big dreamers back then. We just wanted steady work and a place of our own. But things started getting complicated after we got married. And most of the complication has come from one person, my father-in-law, David. David's one of those self-made business guys who built a contracting company from scratch. He's the type who thinks money is the only way to measure success and looks down on anyone who doesn't make six figures. Since he's been wealthy for most of his life, he figured that gave him the right to have the final say on everyone's decisions, especially Sarah's. But I married her, not her family, and I never wanted or needed his approval. It started early, even before we were married. David's comments always had this edge, this backhanded quality. He'd say things like, "Well, Sarah's always been one for charity," when he heard about my job in IT, or "I suppose everyone's got to start somewhere." He thought his daughter deserved the best, and I wasn't it. But as much as it bothered me, I kept my mouth shut, mostly for Sarah's sake. The real trouble started when we got engaged. David offered to pay for almost everything for our wedding. At first, I thought it was a nice gesture. Sarah's his only daughter, and he wanted it to be special. But it didn't take long to realize that paying also meant controlling. Suddenly, everything was his decision. Our plans didn't matter. He was footing the bill, so he had the final say. We'd chosen a small family-owned catering company we both liked, but he canceled them and brought in a big, fancy caterer without even telling us. When I asked him about it, he said, "You want that kind of wedding? Then pay for it yourself." That was David in a nutshell. Generous, as long as you didn't forget who was in charge. I didn't want to start a fight right before the wedding, so I let it go. But that was the start of my resentment toward him. After the wedding, David's entitlement only got worse. He offered to help us manage our money, even though we never asked him to. He'd tell Sarah to bring him our monthly budget, then suggest ways we could cut back to live within our means. This wasn't advice, it was a power play. He wanted to keep tabs on us, remind us that without his money, we were practically nobodies. One day, he made a big deal about how I couldn't afford any luxuries for Sarah. Sarah grew up with certain standards, he told me. Maybe you should focus on raising yours. When I showed him a carefully planned budget I'd made, he just gave me a smug look, as if he thought I was playing at being responsible. Sarah and I were building a life that worked for us. But David couldn't see that. He saw a guy who wasn't making what he thought was real money. And for him, that made me less of a man. Family was important to me, and Sarah knew that. But for David, family values was code for do what I say, or you don't care about family. One time, I had a big deadline at work, and I couldn't make it to a family gathering. He called Sarah after, saying how he was disappointed I couldn't make the time. According to him, I should have just dropped everything because family comes first. I tried to reason with him later, but he kept pushing. So next time, I chose to go to an event for my own family instead. It was my way of showing him that he didn't get to decide where I prioritized my time. He wasn't happy about it, but he couldn't complain in front of Sarah without looking petty. Over time, David's attitude wore me down, but I still thought I could handle it. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah and I were expecting our first child, and I was over the moon. But when we told David, his reaction was different. He looked at me with this smirk, like he thought I'd finally realize what a mistake I'd made. Then, in front of the entire family, he started in with his usual comments about responsibility. With a grand gesture, he said, "A child changes everything. You need to step up and make real money now. My daughter deserves more than a paycheck that barely covers the basics." I tried to brush it off, but he kept going, talking about how maybe Sarah would be better off with a man who could give her what she really deserves. That's when I lost it. I didn't say anything to him then, but that night, lying in bed, I thought about every insult, every way he'd tried to make me feel like less. He'd been acting like he was above me for years. And for the first time, I didn't just want to prove him wrong. I wanted to make him realize that I wasn't the pushover he thought I was. That night, a plan started to form. I knew there was a gap in the market for affordable IT consulting for small businesses, and I'd always wanted to build something of my own. It wasn't out of spite at first. I wanted something that was mine, something no one could take credit for. I started small, taking on a few clients in my spare time while keeping my day job. It was exhausting, but I kept pushing. And eventually my client list grew. Sarah stood by me through it all, sacrificing weekends and time together to let me work. By the end of the first year, I'd made enough to quit my day job and focus on my business full-time. Meanwhile, David had no idea. He thought I was still barely getting by, and he didn't ask about my work. Why would he? He assumed I wasn't capable of anything big. Over the next few years, my business flourished. Ironically, I ended up getting clients from David's industry. Through mutual contacts, I found out that his company was struggling. He'd overextended himself, mortgaged his house, and took on a huge loan to keep up. But a major contract he'd gambled on fell through, and suddenly he was on the edge of bankruptcy. I even heard he was close to losing his house. At first, I thought about helping him, maybe offering him a loan for Sarah's sake. But then I remembered every smug look, every insult. He'd never learn if I bailed him out. So instead, I called the bank and bought his mortgage right from under him. I didn't tell Sarah right away. I wanted everything in place before anyone knew. But once the papers were signed, I told her. She was shocked but understood where I was coming from. She knew better than anyone how her father had tried to tear me down. And honestly, I think she was a little impressed. The next time we saw David, he looked tired, worn down. Halfway through the evening, he pulled me aside. He tried to act casual, saying he was looking for someone to temporarily buy his house while he sorted things out. He never once asked directly. David's pride was still there, even if his money wasn't. I looked him in the eye and said, "Actually, I already bought it." For a second, he just stared. Then his face went pale. "What do you mean you bought it?" he asked, almost whispering. "I bought it from the bank." "The house is mine now," I replied, keeping my voice calm. He tried to protest, saying it was a temporary situation, but I cut him off. "Maybe it's time you focus on living within your means," I told him, echoing his words back at him. He stood there, speechless, completely unprepared. This was a man who'd prided himself on control, on his influence, his place in life. Now he was realizing that I held the cards. For once, he was the one dependent on someone else's mercy, and that someone was me. After the shock wore off, David tried a new angle. He said, "If you're going to be my landlord, at least have some decency to keep the rent reasonable." His voice had a thin edge of desperation that almost sounded like a plea, but I knew better. David didn't ask, he demanded. I kept my expression neutral. "Don't worry, David. I'll keep the rent in line with the market. Fair is fair, right?" He wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. For the first time, David was the one left with no power, no final say. I didn't gloat. I just handed him a copy of the new lease, already prepared with fair, current rates. He stared at the paper in silence, and without another word, he signed. But David didn't just let it go. He couldn't. Even after signing the lease, he tried to assert his influence in any way he could. It was like he couldn't stand the thought of me having any sort of upper hand. He came up with little power plays, trying to poke holes, subtly reminding me that he was still David, still the man of the family. One night, David brought up a suggestion for our newborn son. He proposed that we give our son his last name. According to him, our son deserved to carry on the family legacy. He looked at me as he said it, as if daring me to say no, trying to drag me back under his thumb. I smiled and said, "Actually, Sarah and I like the idea of our son building his own legacy. We'll stick with my name." His face went stiff, and I could tell he wasn't used to hearing no, but he didn't push it. He knew it was a battle he'd lose. David also tried to reassert his supposed authority in the one area he'd always thought I was inferior, my career. He suggested I come work for him, pitching it as a chance to learn from the best. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't offering a job. He was trying to reel me back in, put me under his control again. I just shook my head. "Thanks, but I'm doing pretty well running my own company." He couldn't say anything to that without admitting he'd been wrong about my potential. I saw the frustration in his eyes, but he couldn't respond. Then there was the decor. Since we owned the house, Sarah and I started doing some updates. Fresh paint, a new garden, things to make it ours. David complained about every little change, saying the house looked better before, as if that would stop us. I told him, well, we like it this way, and moved on. He knew there was nothing he could do, but I could see it ate at him that he couldn't control even the look of his house anymore. After a few months, David's attitude seemed to wear down. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. He approached me one evening, pretending to be casual, mentioning that he was having some health issues and might need a temporary rent reduction. He tried to play the sympathy card, implying that it was my duty to help him as family. I knew he wasn't really sick. He was playing one last hand, hoping I'd fall for it. I was willing to help if he'd asked with even a little humility. But instead, I saw this as another attempt to manipulate me, and I couldn't let him get away with it. So I looked him in the eye and said, "Sure, David, I'd be willing to lower the rent if you can handle a few basic maintenance tasks around the house, yard work, minor repairs. Fair trade, right?" I saw the flicker of shock, then anger. He wanted to fight it, but he couldn't admit he wasn't willing to work for a break. Eventually, he agreed, and I saw him realize that his request had backfired. After that, things were different. David seemed to finally understand that his era of control was over. He didn't try to give me advice or push for family dominance like before. We still saw each other at family gatherings, but he was noticeably quieter. Sarah noticed too, and she admitted to me that she'd always known her father was controlling. But seeing me stand up to him made her realize just how much he'd pushed people around. She was proud of me, and that alone made the whole thing worth it. It wasn't about revenge or even putting him in his place. It was about building something for myself and for my family. David had spent years trying to make me feel like I wasn't enough, but now he was living in the proof that he was wrong. Owning his house wasn't the real win. The real win was proving, to myself and to Sarah, that I didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. In the end, David had taught me a valuable lesson. Success isn't measured by anyone else's standards. And he would never have control over my life or my family again.